Hello, Typology friends. Welcome back to the podcast on which we explore the mystery of the human adventure and the human personality through the lens of the Enneagram. As always, I'm joined by my dear friend, Anthony Skinner.
Hello. Good to be with you today.
Great to be with you, Anthony. And our new friend, Jessica Chen. She is an Enneagram 3. She has just learned that she's an Enneagram 3. She has also written this marvelous book called Smart, Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. Now, listen up, everybody. If you are a 4, 5, 6, or 9, you need to hear this show. This show is going to be really important for you if you are a 4, 5, 6, or 9. But it's going to be important for all Enneagram types because we want to understand each other as well as ourselves. So be really listening in on this. Oh, and by the way, if you're a self-pres 3, this is a great show for you. I think it's going to be really, really great. Jessica, welcome to Typology.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so you just learned about the Enneagram. You've been in the corporate world forever. You've probably taken StrengthsFinders, DISC, Myers-Briggs, Berkman. You've taken all the different personality assessments. What was your initial reaction to learning that you were a 3 and to the description of it?
To be honest, it was kind of a mixed emotion kind of thing. You know, I was reading the analysis that came out afterwards, and, a 3 is basically you're an achiever, right? And so immediately I was like, yeah, absolutely. That sounds right in terms of kind of like how I go about things, how I, think about work, and even like why I do the work that I do. But then, of course, part of it is also that you kind of realize what are some of the downfalls of somebody who scores a 3, right? And so I think what I loved about it, though, and I love these types of personality tests because it really kind of shines a light on maybe something that you've always known about yourself, but you really haven't thought too much about. So I loved it. Like I said, it was kind of like a mixed emotion of like, oh, this is what I am. Yeah, that sounds about right. But maybe what else can I do to better improve myself? Which I don't know if that's a number 3 in me talking. But yeah.
That is definitely a 3 in you talking, but it's there's a couple of numbers that care a lot about self-improvement. 1s are very concerned about self-improvement. 3s are very concerned. 3s tend to be a little bit more concerned about issues around productivity and efficiencies. So how can I be more productive and more efficient in how I get things done? But typically 3s are very goal-oriented people. They have goals, they set goals, they love to-do lists, they love to crunch through them, they love having metrics to quantify success, they like incentives for hitting certain benchmarks. Does all this ring true for you?
Totally. And I think back to how this applies to kind of how I work. And it makes sense because so I actually started out my career as a journalist on TV. So I was a TV reporter. And in many ways in that industry, they require you to be very productive, very efficient, because you're often working on a very tight deadline, right? You got to get your things in. You got to be good about your time. So that was that. I did that for over 10 years. And now I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own business. So just as much as having to like get things in and be efficient, I feel like being an entrepreneur, it's almost like 10 times that in me. So I'm curious. I don't know if like the test tells you how strong of a 3 you are, or does it kind of like skew to one number or the other? But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm like heavily a number 3, especially because as an entrepreneur and running my own business, you kind of feel like you have a to-do list the whole time and you got to kind of check it off. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you took I'm really glad you brought that up. So you just took a test that we recently had created, right? So as you know, creating tests that test for things like personality or any psychometric, to do one that isn't like one of these cheap oddball quizzes you find on the internet, which are like ridiculous. Constructing a real psychometric, we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars constructing that test. We used a research psychologist and their team. There were sample pools. We had to test for validity and reliability and accuracy, et cetera. So it's a really good test. And when you go back and you look at your results, it'll actually tell you the percentage of how strong you came in on type. So it'll tell you that, right? When you look back at it. And I really love that test. I'm really, really proud of it. We just launched it about 8 weeks ago into the public domain because we spent 2 long years working on that because I wanted there finally to be one that was really, really top notch, top drawer. So I'm glad you took it, and it sounds like you. So here's a more personal question for you. Threes typically grow up in environments where their own preferences and desires are sort of asked to be put to the side to fulfill the desires of others. And so that they can get the sense that their own feelings don't matter as much as they probably should. And oftentimes threes will say that they don't really feel like they can be loved for who they are as much as for their accomplishments and what they do. Like love is tied to success. Was that your experience as a younger person?
Okay, that's definitely a loaded question. It kind of makes me think back to my own childhood. So I can definitely see some parallels here. So, growing up, my parents are immigrants. So my parents, born and raised in Asia, immigrated here to the US for the American dream, right? They wanted to create a better future for their family, for their children. And sometimes I think like when you grow up in an environment like that, there's a very kind of like defined way of what does success look like. And because my parents didn't come from much, right? They had to build their life here. In many ways, it was always just about you have to study hard. You have to study hard in order to get to a good school. You get to a good school in order for you to get a good job. You get a good job so you can make enough money, right? So it was a very, very linear path in terms of like what success was. And I think for perhaps in many immigrant families, a lot of times success is kind of related to, financial abundance or whatever we want to call it, right? Especially if, they didn't come from a lot of money themselves, right? And so in many ways, like as a young child, right, you want to make your parents proud. You see how much they sacrificed for you and you want to not disappoint them, right? So of course, studying, making sure I got into college and, had a good career. That I think was very much embedded in me. And I think a lot of my peers as well, whose parents are also immigrants. But it's interesting because unlike a lot of my other peers, my parents never necessarily pushed me into a particular career. Because you'll hear a lot of my friends, they'll be like, oh, you only had two choices, right? You had to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, right? Fortunately, my parents never pushed me in that way, but it was never so much about choose a career that makes you happy, but it was just more like, just make sure you do something that's good, even though they never directly said like, oh, it has to be this profession or that profession. But yeah, I definitely see it.
Yeah. I've worked with a number of women clients, and I've heard the doctor lawyer thing about 10 different times. Just my parents told me I had to be a doctor or I had to be a lawyer. And in some ways that can lead to a kind of three-ish dynamic, because in order to do that, many of them had to put aside their own feelings and desires, right? To please parents, right? So I think about a quintessential three is, though he's not Asian, is Andre Agassi. Agassi wrote his memoir Open, right? In which he says, my father always confused his love for tennis with his love for me. And his father was the one who wanted him to be a tennis player. He actually didn't like tennis. He wanted to be a soccer player, but that was unimportant to his dad. And so he had to sort of pursue this life, almost like it's the unlived life of the father. It's very interesting how family dynamics play into the creation of a personality style. And that's why I asked that question. But jumping ahead to the book, give us a 50,000 précis of what it's about. And then I want to dig down onto some topics around a few Enneagram types that I think could really benefit from hearing your message.
Yeah, and I think a part of why I wrote this book is related to my own struggles and my own upbringing. So I wrote the book Smart, Not Loud, How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons, because I personally struggled with getting noticed at work for the right reasons. So in the book, I talk about growing up in a quiet culture, and I'll tell you what the quiet culture is. Quiet culture means being taught principles like listening more than speaking, putting your head down, getting the work done, letting the work speak for itself, not putting yourself out there, not rocking the boat. That's what I call more quiet culture traits. And that's what my parents taught me, taught my brother, and that's how we were taught to behave in many ways. But when you go into the working world, and this is what I argue in the book, the expectation is often showcasing loud culture traits. So loud culture traits are things like speaking up in meetings, pitching your idea, putting yourself out there, not shying away from talking about yourself and your accomplishments, right? So for me personally, when I started working, I felt this friction. I felt stuck a lot of the times where I would find myself at work and I would want to say something. I would want to put myself out there, but I would have this narrative in my own head of saying, oh, don't say anything, or, oh, that's silly, or people already know, right? I was creating this dialogue. Perhaps it's part of wanting to be perfect. Part of it maybe is like, I want to make sure I'm saying the right thing. But a lot of times I felt like I was sort of muted, right? And the funny thing is, because I started out my career on television, as you can imagine, there's a lot of very like extroverted, big personality folks, right? And so it was even harder for me to do it. So it started this whole journey of me trying to understand why I felt so stuck, why it was so hard for me to put myself out there. And this whole book is talking about how I found that, I call it a cultural balance, so that it's not about being loud if you're quiet or quiet if you're loud. It's about how you can be strategic with how you show up so you do get noticed.
Oh, I love that. So I mentioned this earlier. I think there are 4 types on the Enneagram that could benefit from this, because 3 of them are what we call withdrawing types. There are some assertive types, 3s, 7s, and 8s, which is interesting. But there is one 3 that would be likely to not be as outgoing or assertive. It's called a self-preservation 3. And your test, actually, on my Typology Institute Enneagram assessment, it tells you which of those 3 subtypes you are. And so 4s, let me just tell you a little bit about each of these, just a little bit, and why they are the way that they are in this regard, right? So like 4s are called the individualists, and they're emotionally intense people. Their core fear is really being ordinary or lacking identity. And they want to be seen and understood, but they often sort of naturally feel like outsiders. So that makes them hesitant to step into the spotlight, right? And perhaps speak up for themselves. They may also believe that trying to get attention is inauthentic, and authenticity is something really important for 4s, so that might get them to retreat rather than perform. 5s, I'm just giving you a quick rundown on these types, right? But like a 5 is, I love 5s, but a 5 is called the investigator, and they fear being depleted or overwhelmed or seen as incompetent. Depleted, particularly in the relational sphere, right? So it's like relationships can be depleting for 5s, right? They tend to be very reserved, intensely analytical, very private. Certain types get so much energy from relationships, like just talking, being with people. 5s are like, let me get in and out of this as quickly as I can. You know what I mean? Like, because the more time I spend with you, the more my battery is draining down. And they prefer sometimes to observe things rather than be the center of attention. So they like to almost stand at the side and watch, right? 6s, generally, they're called the loyalists. Sometimes they don't want attention because they are kind of fearful, anxious types, and being in the spotlight makes them feel vulnerable to attack, right? And then 9s are the peacemakers, and they are like, we call them the sweethearts of the Enneagram, but they are afraid of asserting their own opinions, preferences, and often they will merge with the preferences and the opinions of the group or another individual rather than state their own. So in order to avoid conflict or upsetting the apple cart, right? So these 4 types need to hear your message. I'm sorry I took so long to do that, but I want the audience to hear why it's important that they check out this book, Smart Not Loud, How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. Those 4 types in particular would really benefit from it. So knowing that that's the case, how can people do what you're asking them to do, which is to find their voice in their context, to find this place of balance, and to, in service to their own careers and fulfillment?
It's so interesting because when I was hearing you describe the other numbers, even though I scored a 3, I feel like I can really empathize with those feelings that you just mentioned. And I think this is because of this cultural upbringing I talk about in the book, because even though I scored a 3, which some may say, which number 3 is like kind of like this achiever type, kind of like, put yourself out there type, and that's why I'm always like, wow, I wonder if I had always been a 3, or is it because of my profession, because of my own work experience, I've almost molded myself to become a 3. But hearing the other numbers, I completely empathize because I almost feel like that was me too. Or in many ways, it might still be me deep down inside. I've just learned to sort of reframe it. And so that kind of goes to the question that you asked, right? Like, how can people, whether you are rooted in those numbers, and how can you go about reframing it? I think about the four cultural reframes I talk about. So it's thinking about how you communicate with people. It's thinking about how you think about spending your time at work. It's talking about how you think about celebrating your accomplishment and conflict. So let me just kind of go through the 4. So I think for a lot of us, quiet, and I'll use just the quiet and loud culture because that's just kind of what I talk about in the book. So I think for a lot of us, quiet culture or loud culture people, sometimes we can see it in black and white, whether it's like, should I speak or shouldn't I speak? Speak or not to speak, right? It's very like black and white, yes or no.
Right.
But the reframe I always encourage people is not should you or shouldn't you, it's when you speak. When you speak, always think about who you're speaking with in that meeting, for example. Who's in that meeting? Who are the stakeholders? What do they care about? And if you lead with that, it can completely transform how you convey your message. So it's not about getting in this narrative of, should I say something? Should I not say something? It's like, no, when I say something, how can I make sure I'm thinking about my audience, right? And I think that's just like a whole nother way of thinking. That's communication. The second one is how you think about spending your time at work. And this basically means for a lot of us quiet culture people, we tend to just kind of put our head down, get the work done. We don't seek the spotlight. I think that's one of the numbers you mentioned. These are people who don't want to put themselves out there, right? But what I have found is sometimes if you just put your head down and do the work, you're not going to get noticed in the way you want to be noticed. Working hard is status quo. Working hard is expected. You're hired at a particular company to get the job done. But in order for you to really get those bigger opportunities, I say it's using the work that you're doing and using it as leverage. So think about it as building your credibility jar. You're doing all the good work. You're adding coins into this jar. At some point, you got to cash it in. So when your manager is in a good mood, timing is right, you can say like, hey, I'm so glad we finished this one big project, but I've been thinking about this new idea that I think can help our team. You're cashing it in that sense. You're not just doing what's assigned to you. You're thinking about what interests you, and then you're asking for it. I think that's a more strategic way of thinking about how you do the work that you do. The other thing is celebrating. So celebrating the amazing work that you're doing. For a lot of us quiet culture people, we don't like to boast. We tend to be more humble, right? It's all about just kind of maybe using our work as a way for it to speak for itself. But I found that like in order for you to get noticed at work, people have to know your impact. But it's not about, look at me, look how amazing I am, because no one likes that. It's about completing that message. So, hey, I finished this one project and look at how it streamlined this. Look at how it improved this. So basically, in you celebrating your work, you're telling people how it's impacted others. I think that's a more holistic way. And then finally, conflict. I don't know what number this one is, but people who just really don't like conflict. They avoid conflict. They want to maintain a harmonious environment. And for a lot of quiet culture people, that's just the same way. We're taught to not rock the boat, kind of, keep a low profile. But what I have found is if you want to get noticed at work, you have to not shy away from conflict, but focus on what I call the dynamics at play. That means stepping back. What happened here? When did things go wrong? Who needs to know? How can I be proactive about communicating this? And what I have found is in many corporate workplaces, let's be real, people don't like to be surprised because it can also make them look bad. So being proactive and offering people solutions is a great way to even think about maintaining your reputation. So these are kind of some of the reframes I personally have adopted, and now this is what I teach people on. It's not about being quiet or loud. It's about thinking about work in these ways because that can help you get noticed.
I love that. And all right, listen, everybody. Self-pres 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, and 9s. I sure hope you're listening because this is right up your alley. In fact, there are a number of types that don't like conflict, but the one that really doesn't like conflict are 9s. That's why they're called the peacemakers or the mediators. And rather than engage in conflict, they often will retreat or just merge with the group, right? Like, I don't want to say anything that's going to, so I'll just merge with the opinions of the company or this team, this division, my boss, right? When in fact, they may have really great insights that would help, would help the company, but they're afraid to articulate them, right? They don't want to stand out in that way. So to imagine you're talking with someone who's looking to make a change in their career or quote unquote rebrand themselves, what would you tell them?
Ooh. If they're looking to make a change or rebrand, the one thing that I always tell people that they need to start thinking about, there's a term I use in the book, it's called building your career brand. People are like, oh, it's like personal brand. Yes, it's pretty similar to personal brand, but I like to call it career brand because it's kind of thinking about your career. And it's thinking about, what do you want to be known for? And this goes beyond just your reputation at your current company. You think about people when they use the term thought leadership, for example, right? Thought leadership is a way of branding yourself that goes beyond the organization you're working at. So whatever it is you want to be known for, a particular skill set, an expertise, I always say double down on writing about it, talking about it, pitching yourself for certain projects where you can showcase this expertise. Or if you don't have it currently within your team, maybe creating a brand new project that can showcase this particular skill set that you want to be known for. Because that in and of itself is what I call your career brand. And whether you stay at this company or you're trying to make a jump to another organization, this is what can stay with you. And before you know, and this is part of getting noticed at work for the right reasons, what you want people to do is when they hear, oh, Ian, oh, Anthony, what are the things that come to mind? I always say you can control that narrative. And if you don't control that narrative, other people are going to control that narrative for you. You might start to be boxed into a certain role you don't want to do, right? So thinking about what is it that you want to be known for and finding opportunities and projects for you to showcase that.
It's interesting. Look, we had Susan Cain on the show, right? And I know you've read Quiet, probably. And Susan's a great guest and very articulate. I'm actually rather drawn to introverts. I like quiet people. I don't mind, declarative, gregarious types, but I always find quieter, more introverted people a little more fascinating, sometimes more interesting, well thought out. But I also know, actually from even the world of psychological testing, that extroversion, people who are extroverted tend to do better in the workplace. It's just, at least in American culture, that's the truth. Extroverts tend to win out, right? So I guess the question I have then is, like, how can leaders in the workplace create a more welcoming environment for people who are quieter, for people who are more introverted, for people who are not particularly self-promotional by nature, Like, how do we, because they have so much to bring to the table of life, and I would love to have them not be ignored.
Yeah, and that is the most important question. So I talk about this thing called the quiet culture bias. And the quiet culture bias basically is the perception people have of folks like us who tend to be more on the quiet side. And what's the bias? The assumption is because Jessica doesn't speak up much in meetings, she probably doesn't care too much. Because Jessica isn't saying too much, she's probably not engaged or she's not interested in doing that project. Now, I know for me, yes, it does take some initiative on my part to try to learn the skills to speak up, to get my ideas across. But for the people who, like you just mentioned, who tend to be on the more extroverted, the quote unquote loud culture side, right? I think it's equally as important for them to know about folks like us, and that it doesn't mean because we tend to be more quiet or more quiet nature that we don't care. that we're not engaged, that we're not interested. That's actually not the case, right? Like you just said, sometimes it takes us a little bit more time to be more, thoughtful with how we say something. I think for a lot of us quiet culture people, we put so much pressure on ourselves to only say something if it's of value. I only want to say something if it's valuable to the team, for other people. But that is so much pressure. And so the thing that I always tell folks is, actually, what's valuable is quite subjective. What's valuable to you might be super valuable or maybe not valuable to somebody else. But the point is, it's subjective. So what I say is, even if you think it's common knowledge to you, why don't you just say it? Because that could be brilliant to somebody else. Maybe you even asking that question can get somebody else thinking about it that they never thought about before, right? So that's why I always say, right? It's what's valuable is very subjective.
So how do you coach people for whom anxiety is so difficult, right? Because I mean, like, there are certain types on the Enneagram that actually get calories from just talking out loud. they actually get energy from just riffing, and just opining or just talking, processing aloud, and other types that, taking center stage, using their voice really causes a lot of anxiety and negative self-talk. Like, so how do you help people in that category?
So there's two ways, really. So the first one is the self-awareness, right? The self-awareness of you recognizing that you have something to say, but you're kind of hitting this wall. And I think for a lot of us, and I know this myself because I experience this, it's like when I'm in a meeting and you're kind of like, oh, I feel like I have something that I want to add, but it feels really difficult to find the right time to chime in, or you feel like you're about to chime in and somebody talks over you, or maybe you do, and then again, people talk over you, right? And so it's a lot of times it's a very physical feeling too, right? So that anxiety can build up of like, okay, maybe let me just not say it, or let me just kind of step back and defer to others, right? So I think it's that self-awareness of like when it's happening, as it's happening, right? But then the second thing, and this is like the most important part, is to not let that anxiety, that deferring to others stop you from continuing, right? And so, what I always say is, if you're feeling any sort of way where you're uncomfortable, put that uncomfortable feeling, like I like to get people to think about it like physically, like think about an object and you're moving it to the side. You're not throwing it away. Just move that feeling of anxiety, maybe to, the corner over there or in the room, and then just go and say what you want. And like I said earlier, this sense of, should I say something? Should I not say something? Is it valuable? Is it not valuable? All those things I kind of shared, how you can rethink it. And that's what this is the moment where you have to apply that. Whether it's, what's valuable is subjective, right? Again, we don't know. You just got to say it, right? And honestly, the one thing is, what's the worst thing that can happen, right? You say what you have to say. What's the worst thing that can happen?
I love that. So knowing that there are types that struggle with conflict, like, how do quiet culture people who are worried about conflict, how do they engage in it, like in a way that's really helpful and useful?
So I get it. No, in general, like dealing with conflict is probably very uncomfortable for many of us. So the way I see it is, I think about the word credibility and conflict. And when we think about in the context of like a working environment, right? Like conflict often means engaging in difficult conversations. Conflict can be when you make a mistake or when you're trying to tell somebody that they made a mistake, right? These are all kind of very uncomfortable feelings, which I kind of bucketed into uncomfortable conversations, right? And I think for a lot of us quiet culture people, we hate these feelings. Like we hate engaging with people either because we don't like the feeling or we just don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable, right? But when we think about the word credibility, right, in the working sense, I have found the quickest way to shatter your own credibility is to hide. People tend to appreciate those who are proactive in engaging in these difficult conversations. It's better to address things earlier than later, right? And being transparent and honest, thinking about, again, credibility these are kind of like the ingredients that could help you. Because what I found is if you sometimes shy away, or for us, maybe if you're more introverted, for example, right, you want to try to solve the problem yourself. You kind of put your head down. But again, sometimes people actually appreciate you presenting problems ahead of time because then they can trust your judgment. And so that's kind of like one of the things that I always get people to try to like understand is like, being proactive and honest and transparent. But not only that, and this is a very important part of it, if there is a problem, sharing some solutions that you've thought about. It might not be the solution, the right solution, but at least you're proactively showing people that you're thinking about ways to help solve the problem. And that can help build credibility.
I love that. I was recently re-listening to, Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication, and how just to and I thought, it's so simple, but it's pretty genius. Like this whole idea of, communicating, here's what I think happened, here's how I feel about it, here's what I need, and what can be done to meet my need. I mean, these are like so basic things, but I just find that for these, particularly those types, 4s, 5s, 6s, and 9s, even reading like nonviolent communication is like so helpful because it's just not it's not my natural way of being in the world, right? Mm-hmm. Like for me to have, it's interesting as a therapist, I can literally, when I'm in the space of doing group therapy or therapy, I can be very bold and forthright. I can have hard conversations, but the power balance is set up in my favor because I'm the therapist, right? Like, in other words, it's like, I got a lot less to lose in here than anybody else, right? Like, it's like, but outside of therapy rooms, I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. It's like, I don't want to have that hard conversation. I want to help you have that conversation. Yeah, it's so funny.
Actually,
it's not my nature.
It reminds me because so I have a 3-year-old, so I have a toddler, and you learn so much when you parent, a child. You learn so much about yourself in the process too. And this is the world I'm currently living in right now because, when I say I have difficult conversations with my 3-year-old, so the difficult conversation is obviously is getting him to listen, to comply, and he's saying no, and he's yelling, right? And that's to me, it's a very difficult situation to be in. And so, similarly, kind of thinking about this, what I've learned in parenting, even just a toddler, is myself, which is the self-regulation, the emotional regulation that I'm going through when I feel myself getting uncomfortable or angry in that moment, right? When I'm trying to tell him to pick up his toys and he's like, no, right? I myself feel myself boiling up in anger, right? Because he's arguing, right? But then what I realized is I have to kind of regulate myself and my own feelings and kind of detach myself in order for me to communicate with him properly, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, listen, Jessica, we're going to sign off here, but tell my little 4s, 5s, 6s, and 9s. No, better yet, tell my 1s, my 2s, lots of my 3s, my 7s, my 8s, how they can best serve quiet culture people in the workplace so that they can really thrive. Because I think
that's a great question.
Probably loud culture people, they're not the most self-aware of types, necessarily. So what can they do?
3 things. And I actually have a little acronym for it. ARC. So if you want to support folks like me, right, who tend to be maybe more on the reserved, quiet side, there's 3 things. A, ask, never assume, right? Never assume that just because someone's more quiet, that they don't care, that they don't want to participate, right? The R is creating a runway. So for a lot of folks like us, and it's ironic when I say us because I'm a 3, but I'm more talking about the sense of being more on the quieter side. Mm-hmm. Runway means if you know this person tends to have a hard time putting themselves out there, having a hard time speaking up in a meeting, creating a runway for them to speak up. For example, hey, Anthony, I know you had that brilliant idea that you shared with me last week. Do you want to share this with the team? Or Ian, you just finished that one project. There was some really great outcome from that. Do you want to, share with folks, or do you want to do a quick 2-minute presentation on it? Right? It's creating a runway for them who they themselves might not necessarily raise their hand for. And then the C, ARC, the C is celebrate. So celebrating the things that they are doing, that thing, that project, whatever, that initiative that they finish, and as a manager, for example, if you are a manager, you saw it, you're proud about it, let people know. Celebrating, these folks, it improves morale. It makes us, for example, feel so much better. So I think when we think about supporting, ARC, ask, never assume, runway, so creating a runway, and C, it's celebrating them and their accomplishments.
Oh man, so good.
Love that.
Jessica, I have loved this conversation. And I want to really commend your book, Smart Not Loud. And I want our folks to make sure that they check it out. The subtitle is How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. We're talking with Enneagram 3, Jessica Chen. Jessica, tell folks where they can learn more about you and the book.
Yes, so I'm most active on LinkedIn, so please connect with me there. You can find me Jessica Chen page. That's actually my handle for all the social media channels like Instagram. But really, it's just if you resonated with any of the things I talked about, it's definitely all in the book, Smart Not Loud, How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons, anywhere you get your books in the bookstore.
I love that. Jessica, thank you. Anthony, thank you, brother.
Thank you, man. Good to be with you all today.
Good to be with you, and listen up, everybody. May you have love. May you have joy. May you have peace. May you have healing. May you have rest. Until next time, be well.